There are a lot of bad ideas in the history of mental health. On my list are the lobotomy, sterilization of the, quote, feeble-minded, and most recently, giving police the work of doing wellness checks on people in emotional distress. The 1960s idea of deinstitutionalizing mental health, shuttering large institutions like Riverview Hospital, and opting for people in mental health crisis to recover in their communities of origin was a good idea that went wrong. Essentially, because the money saved by closing institutional care was never fully reinvested in community services. However, in the early 1970s in Vancouver, there were some very interesting and I think hopeful projects that aspired to create supportive and enabling communities for ex-patients, and which involved a complex renegotiation of professional power, consumer engagement, and new ways of providing community mental health services. I'm taking a micro-history approach tonight, and I'm looking for a usable past. Now, I'm aware that using the past in a simplistic fashion is problematic. We have an excellent homegrown illustration of this in Alberta's recent adventures in elementary education curriculum. But this evening, aware in this third wave of the pandemic that Canadians are dealing with unprecedented uncertainty, worry, isolation, and grief, I thought it was an excellent time to open up the mental health storage closet and see what we have there that might be helpful. Community mental health in the 1970s was based on emerging ideas of individual rights, but it was also about fostering integration into the community. This is social citizenship. Researchers looking at deinstitutionalization in the Netherlands talk about relational citizenship, arguing that patients become citizens through interactions. Essentially, this is about finding something larger than yourself, a place to belong, and an identity beyond that of patient. Tonight, I'm going to introduce you to some of the actors in Vancouver's systemic mental health shift from institution to community, but they are actors that occupied kind of a series of different positions. However, they shared two things. They had a vested interest in making supportive mental health communities work, and they believed that caring relationships located in the community, as opposed to the institution, had the capacity to promote integration and belonging. I also want to make a pitch for inserting mental health activism into the historiography of what historians call the long 1960s. First of all, I'm going to give you 3 short thumbnail sketches of 3 projects or case studies that I'm looking at. The Mental Patients Association, or MPA, began in the fall of 1970. Lanny Beckman was a newly discharged patient from the psych ward at VGH and attending a day program. Several members of the group committed suicide on the weekend when the program wasn't running. The professionals in charge clamped down on the suggestion that attendees share a phone list for support on the weekend. But this was 1970, so of course they did it anyway. This was the beginning of a collective response that became MPA. Now, Lanny and a small group of other patients reached out to progressive Vancouver Sun columnist Bob Hunter, one of the founders of Greenpeace, to publicize the new group, and they applied for funding from the Company of Young Canadians and the federal government's Local Initiative Program, or LIP. By 1975, MPA was thriving. It had hundreds of members. It had a staff of 25. a busy drop-in in the heart of Kitsilano, living accommodation for 50 people in MPA-owned houses, and a policy, research, and public education program. Using the principle of participatory democracy, so shared running, the running of the organization was done jointly by all members. MPA members' meetings were lively forums where budgetary, organizational, and employment decisions were decided by community votes. Its tabloid paper, in a nutshell, was a leader in critical thinking about psychiatry, patient rights, and mental health policy. Although non-patients like Stan Persky, Barry Cool, Arthur Giovanzo, and Jeff McMurtry came to the group as allies, a shared personal experience of mental health remained the great leveler at MPA. Anyone familiar with the folks I've just listed will immediately realize that MPA was a gay-positive organization. And strong feminists like Patty Gazzola and Judy Chamberlain were early leaders in the organization. Similarly, although members looked up to Lanny Beckman because of his intellectual achievements, class differences appear muted. John Hapfel, whose quote anchored my last slide, or Dave Beamish, who you will meet in a few minutes, were not prohibited from advancing in the organization because they were working class. Race is a more elusive variable to contend with regarding MPA. Indigenous people from the nearby Indian Friendship Center may have hung out at the drop-in, and there were certainly racialized members, but they were not leaders in the organization during its early years. Okay, I now want to tell you about the Kitsilano Citizens Committee. We found out about the Kitsilano Citizens Committee by accident when we were interviewing psychiatrist Hugh Parfit, who headed up the local community mental health team. The KITS team was part of the Vancouver Plan, a 1970 scheme drawn up by psychiatrist John Cummey and implemented the following year. The intention was to set up neighborhood care teams in close collaboration with community members and organizations. And this fit with what the newly elected NDP did in other locations. The teams ran on an open door model. They accommodated walk-in patients and also people just looking for company and a cup of coffee, and focused on life skills like finding an apartment and getting a job. In early 1973, the newly established mental health team began to, quote, feel their way into the community, as Hugh put it. This was a new and exciting chapter in Hugh's career, and he stressed that the KITS team sought to democratize mental health work. He spoke specifically about the Kitsilano Citizens Committee, a short-lived initiative to provide community input. And the citizens committees connected to local mental health teams were indeed short-lived. They had entirely vanished from the landscape of community health in Vancouver by 1978. Most were only active for 1 or 2 years. One of its founders described the Vancouver Emotional Emergency Centre as awkwardly named, and I must agree. VEEC provided short-term residential support for people in mental health crisis. Funding was always a struggle, and in the end, VEEC only lasted for 2 years, but it has a bit of a legendary status, not the least because disability activist and writer Judy Chamberlain lived there, first as a resident and then as a worker. One could smile, and of course, actually I did smile, reading of therapeutic macrame and VEEC's basement screen room. But this was a serious and in many cases successful effort to provide an alternative to mainstream mental health services. It was also a self-conscious experiment, a quest to create a new model for supporting people in crisis. In 1973, Tom Sanborn was, quote, into a typically 70s rogue Vancouver psychotherapy practice, leading encounter and Gestalt groups. The MPA founders were friends and political colleagues, so it made sense that they suggested that Tom submit an LIP grant for residents for people in psychiatric distress who didn't want psychiatric intervention. So Tom pulled in a bunch of people, and just to name a few, Ellen Frank, who later became prominent in Vancouver's feminist and lesbian circles, social worker Kathy Kidd, who was frustrated that clients were regarded as, quote, a separate species, and Molly Dexel, an older MPA member and survivor of many EC treatments at Riverview. They found a house in Mount Pleasant area and painted it collectively, selecting a tomato red to go with the shingled wall in the dining room. So 70s, I love it. When Veek opened its doors in mid-January 1974, good old Bob Hunter wrote a column about them that brought in furniture, bedding, and lots of volunteers. Clients were called residents, and they could stay for 2 weeks. Tom described the residents: street kids, pretty tough and grimy; dreamier middle-class hippie kids; older, scuffed-up psychiatric survivors. Now I want to take a step backward to place this microhistory on a broader canvas. An astonishing amount of radical stuff happened in Vancouver in the early 1970s. To list just a few initiatives, the left-wing printing collective, Press Gang, Greenpeace, MEC, Windsor House School, First Step Housing Cooperative, People's Law School, and the Women's Bookstore. MPA, Veek, and the Kitsilano Citizens Committee were part of this quest for different ways of seeing and being in the world. But we don't learn about them in radical histories of the place and period. So if we were at Nat Bailey Stadium, the score would look something like this. Lanny Beckman argues that mental patients' liberation, an idea that MPA pioneered in Canada, is excluded from the history of 1970s social justice groups because it did not share the same successful emancipatory future. Now, being written out of history is never a benign process. With radical mental health alternatives left out of the historical record, it is easier for mainstream groups like the Canadian Mental Health Association to define the current mental health agenda. Listen to Lanny Beckman speak with my colleague, Marina Moreau, about how liberation movements of the period gave shape and content to what was happening at MPA.
So what do you think, when you think back to the time period, and obviously it was a time where there was a lot of, burgeoning social movements, the feminist movement, the gay liberation movement, where did sort of, from your perspective, was there actual sort of talk about mental patients' liberation? Where did that sort of fit into that?
Well, there was, but it wasn't there at the beginning. I'm not even sure it was at the beginning for me. I mean, I had studied in Buffalo, so in the U.S. between 64 and 66, and that's when the 60s started happening. And I was in America while it was happening. I was also at a university, which meant that I was around other guys who could be drafted.
Right.
I mean, college was an exemption, but if somehow, if you didn't pass, if you didn't make it in college, you were subject to the draft, and that could be changed at any time too. So the issues were very obvious, and so that was part of the student movement. The anti-war movement, the Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement. So all of that was happening, you know, and I felt as if like that I was sort of there at the epicenter. And I was confused by a lot of it, but I felt attracted to it. I felt that somehow it just seemed natural that I would be part of these movements. And I was, but then...
So Lanny's talking about one way of looking at this, but I want to point out that this process also worked in the other direction. Many social movement people of the early 70s were inspired by Foucault and Goffman. That's where they were picking up their anti-psychiatry, anti-institution stance. And books by radical psychiatrists Thomas Szasz from the US and R.D. Laing from the UK were popular reading. And these ideas were very much present in Wieck. Tom Sanborn mentioned that he was influenced by Laing and the Radical Therapy Collective out of Berkeley. And here is longtime MPA member Patty Gazzola speaking on the topic.
You know, like MPA believed in supporting people who wanted to try and go off medications. You know, but it was suggested that they do it gradually and that they look into like their diet and exercise and other things, and like if it wasn't successful they could go back on, you know. But yeah, the group didn't believe that like medication was the end all be all, you know, that there were some people that it worked for, and like it's not up to us to say which ones. Like, yeah, people have a right to plot their own destiny, and you know, we subscribe to people like Thomas Szasz, who was like a psychiatrist that was like an anti-psychiatrist who believed in people taking responsibility for their actions. And then we had another fellow come that ran a dream workshop that worked with R.D. Laing in England, and the process there of believing that medication stopped people from going through the process and coming out the other side. And you know, so we like experimented with letting people plot their own destiny, basically.
So Patty is interesting. I think that MPA members might not have known Laing by name, but that didn't matter because at MPA, the ideas of these theorists were scripted into the everyday practices of the group. And this allowed members to set aside self-stigmatization and to avoid seeing their mental health difficulties as shameful personal failings, because they put them in a broader context, more politicized context. Hugh Parfitt didn't agree with Laing and Szasz. He was antagonistic towards their perspective, and he thought they were too theoretical to be useful. But still, he read and considered their ideas. Now I'm going to shift in my talk a little bit to trace two citizenship themes. I'm going to look at how attempts were made in various of the projects to flatten hierarchies in the mental health world. And I'm going to consider how experiential knowledge of mental health was valued. And I'm going to try to move to the next.
You know, like MPA believes.
Okay, perfect. The next slide. Now, MPA was an engine of social citizenship. Dave Beamish, who joined the group in the first months of 1972, illustrates how becoming a member of the group could be transformative, allowing people to develop positive new identities as ex-patient, consumer, or experiential expert.
Well, I like to say that when I first went to MPA, I had just enough self-esteem to get through the door, and that was it. And that's true, I had lousy self-esteem. But pretty soon when I was there, I got feeling better about myself. I found that I could do different things that I hadn't known I could do them before, because it gave me the opportunity to do them, you know. And so we did a lot of speaking engagements, and I worked in all the drop-in centers, and I worked at Riverview twice on a project out there.
When Patty saw a clip from our documentary, when Lanny saw a clip from our documentary of Patty talking about working at MPA, his face just lit up, and he responded with a sense of enthusiasm and connection. And this is what he wrote about that moment and about Patty and her job. This is MPA at its best, a place where members develop their intelligence to deal with the real and complicated world, to promote the welfare of the community as a whole.
Well, it was more than a salary, like it was a whole network. Because when I moved out here, I only knew like one or two people. And all of a sudden, like I had this huge network of people. And to be able to get paid for doing something that you were doing anyhow, that was like a big bonus. And obviously it helps your self-esteem when you're not on welfare and you don't have to go beg for things, like you're supporting your family and doing it on your own. Yeah, and I kind of grew with the role. Like I got more and more knowledge, the longer you're there. And, like I said, like building an apartment building. Who would have thought, right? And then doing the juggling for even like getting the carpeting and stuff. We had people say, okay, like if you can get the Vancouver Foundation to give you half the money, we'll give you the other half. And then we go to the lottery people and they say, well, we want them to commit to their half and then we'll give you the other half. So trying to just get everybody together at the same time with a yes.
In the mid-1970s, MPA took their model of participatory democracy across town to Riverview Psychiatric Hospital. Vircha, Maureen and I were just fascinated by this radical community organization opting to work for change within an institution that they constantly critiqued, and aiming to flatten the hospital hierarchy by inserting a patient's perspective into policy and practice. Now, the Riverview Project grew out of MPA's weekly visits to members who were in the hospital. Dave became very involved in this group, identifying as an ex-Riverview patient. And when it became a funded program in 1977, he got the position of manager. So listen to Dave talk. And when he starts, you'll see a real shift and a lift in his voice when he moves from talking about working at the MPA drop-in to the innovation and innovative things he did at Riverview.
What did you do?
Oh, various things. I've worked in all the drop-in centers and managed a couple of projects at Riverview Hospital for them.
Great. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that work?
Well, the drop-in center, you just do whatever comes up, you try and help people, try and keep out of trouble. But the projects at Riverview Hospital were interesting. One of them, we hired patients from the hospital to work on the project, and that was something quite different,
What year was that?
That would be close to 1980, I guess.
Okay. Was that called the Riverview Extension Project, or do you remember the name?
Probably. I don't remember the name.
So tell me a little bit more about the Riverview work, because that's very interesting.
Well, we used to do stuff there that the social workers should have done. Somebody gets evicted, gets their stuff all taken away. We would go and get the stuff for them, make sure they got it back. And just help people to get ready to leave the hospital. I used to sit on review panels. In those days, you didn't have to be a professional to sit on them. And I sat on review panels and helped people out, try to advise them the best way they could get out of the place that they wanted out. Didn't always work, but tried.
Yeah, and imagine having an ex-patient, help give you that kind of support and guidance. It would be different than what they'd hear from a professional, I should say.
For sure.
Yeah. About just surviving, that's really valuable. So, but you said that the patients worked on that too. Did you say the patients at Riverview?
Yeah, we hired patients at Riverview.
to...
By election, to work with us. Do the same kind of jobs we were doing.
Right, right.
When they were doing it from the hospital.
So who would have thought of the Riverview work, and whose idea was that? How did projects come about?
There was funding available for projects. The Liberal government had these fundings available. We just got one and went there.
Okay.
We sort of made it up as we went along.
Like maybe a LIP grant, or would it be...
Probably was an LIP grant, probably.
Right.
We got two of them. You're only supposed to finish the one, and that was it, but we got a second one and faked it. So we got two.
You faked it?
Sort of, yeah.
Meanwhile, back in Kitsilano in early 1973, as the illustration on this slide shows, thanks to Hugh for saving his papers and sharing them with us, the new mental health team sought input from local organizations. MPA members went to these meetings and used them as a venue for challenging the established system. But they also showed that they talked about the key services that they were already providing for ex-patients, establishing experiential expertise as a new cornerstone of community mental health work. And here, Hugh Parfit describes the team's early interaction with MPA as a two-way learning process that evolved into a working relationship over time.
We had a lot in common because we were all of us were interested in people with mental illness and how to help those people. That was basically, we were all coming from the same perspective in that way, but as I said, there was quite a bit of strain because we had different perspectives on how to go about it, and it was a learning process for both sides. We were all of us learning. We had to learn how to be, I think, a bit more accepting of different behavior in the way that the MPA were, being able to accept the behavior of their clients that came in, or their members, I should say. And we had to learn a lot from them about how to be with people with mental illness
In the community.
Yes, and how to understand how that, how to do that, how to be with people who are not the same as other people, and so on. They had a lot to teach us in that regard, and they had a learning process where they had to. The MPA would attract people to come and work there, either as volunteers or getting hired on staff, and there were people who came to that with their own particular background and their own particular biases, and some of those people had very, very firm ideas without much direct experience. They would come they would be attracted to the MPA as a place where, stuff was happening, a new approach to mental illness and so on. Mm-hmm. But they came in with very firm ideas about how without really knowing much, really practical about how it would be. So what I would see would be a process where a person beginning to work with the MPA would begin to sort of develop more awareness and understanding of what it was really about, and that in the end would enable them to work more closely with us. And I think they, from their side, probably saw a similar process happening, where we would come in with our fixed ideas about how things should be done, and over time they would teach us, or we would learn from them, maybe things could be done differently.
In March 1973, the KITS team met with a group of community organizations, some people from the local health unit, the school board, and other groups, and John, including MPA, of course. And John Kyle, the head of the Greater Vancouver Mental Health Project, proclaimed to those present, "The power is yours." A handful of MPA members became regular attendees at the Citizens Committee meetings and helped draft a proposal for the Kitsilano project and an alternative budget. We were very wary of whether or not this was designed to undermine organizations like MPA and sort of normalize them and then control them, Stan Persky recalled. And Barry Cool raised concerns on the pages of the Nutshell about the creation of a little river view in the neighborhood. But Lanny's inked jottings on his copy of the Vancouver plan suggest a pragmatic willingness to engage in the process. Patronizing, but we can agree in principle, and okay, let's take him up on it. So the committee proposed a pretty radical alternative budget, which included hiring 2 non-professional mental health workers and allocating funds for patient travel, a crisis center, a drop-in, and emergency food and clothing. We did come to a final proposal after quite a few months of negotiations, Hugh told me. The plot of Hugh's story was revealed towards the end of his interview, when he explained that the NDP member of health, Dennis Koch, dismissed the budget. Months wasted, citizens' participation crushed, the Nutshell proclaimed. And here you can see the December 1973 cartoon and the front page of the Nutshell lampooning the mental health team. The Nutshells are just wonderful, the early Nutshells. At the Veek House in East Vancouver, there were no pack rats like Hugh and Lanny, but I found an extensive report cum diary by Ellen Frank in the Provincial Archives. And here she is in front of Veek with Tom Sanborn. At Veek, there was a continued emphasis at breaking down barriers between stakeholders, residents, volunteers, and staff. And indeed, residents did return as volunteers and in some cases become staff. And as the diary entries on the slideshow show, staff also became residents. Not that this never happened in traditional mental health systems, but at Veek it was regarded as the natural order. Although Tom and others were committed to Gestalt techniques and alternative treatments like deep massage, they soon realized that they didn't want to be, quote, doing therapy on people. Within a few months, there appears to have been a shift towards encouraging active listening and communication skills rather than pressuring residents towards intense daily therapy. I want to address the aspect of Veek's practice that gets it a place in MAT history. Its decision to ban residents who use psychiatric medication. But first, I want you to listen to Tom address this point in his 2010 oral history interview.
What we wanted to do was to create a space where people have the choice, and more or less an informed choice. What we can do for you is be with you in a respectful way while you have whatever process you're going to have. We won't give you any drugs. We won't give you electroshock. We won't lock you up. We won't pretend that we can take charge of your life, your safety. That may be riskier for you than being in a hospital. It may be better for you than being in a hospital. We can't judge that for sure. But what we can do is have this space open and try to work with you as respectfully and caringly as we can, as long as you want to. If you change your mind and you want to go into a more formal hospital situation or you want to talk to a doctor about drugs, we'll help you do that. But what we're doing here is drug-free. It relies on human contact and on the idea that there's a kind of resilience, a kind of source of healing at the center of human experience, and that if you encounter that in company with people who are your community, your chances of coming through and getting to a better place are better than they are if you're in the hospital. Always true? Probably not. But true often enough and for enough people that it made sense to do the experiment, and I think provided some useful experience for a lot of people.
In her report, Ellen Frank presents this collective decision as rooted in a process of experiential education that took place over their first months of operation. Listen to this excerpt. Looking back on February, I was amazed. Before we started, most of us were personally against psychiatric drugs, but by February, we were really sucked in. As I reread the log, I am amazed that we allowed the abuse of drugs to happen and how we've changed and very much hardened in our line. By mid-May, staff were having, quote, very serious discussions on the question, upset that mental health teams were referring clients on large doses of long-term tranquilizers. They were getting, quote, too many street people, too many constant crisis people, too many socialized patients. And in June, they arrived at a concrete policy which, and here I quote Frank again, comes out of our experiences, trials, and follies in the last few months. Now, Frank and her colleagues believe that pharmaceuticals and recreational drugs prohibited the emotional expression and self-awareness that was fundamental to the process that Tom just described to you. Since they had only 6 beds, better to focus on those who would benefit from what they had to offer, people in a situational crisis like a relationship breakdown, family troubles, or a major life change. This radical decision netted Veek criticism within the local mental health community. Jerry Walker, the irreplaceable bookkeeper at MPA, pointed out that this disqualified most people under emotional strain, and a street worker for the Vancouver Resource Board's Gastown team renamed Veek the Vancouver Limited Emotional Centre, saying, I don't know what they're doing, but they're not doing anything for us. Lanny has spoken about the longing for the old MPA, not nostalgia, but something more profound. I think he's talking about community, occupation, and unjudging and friendly support. Things that really come through, I think, in Patty and Dave's clips that I've shown in my presentation. John Hatfull spoke at the opening of our 2018 public history exhibit here in Vancouver about MPA. John is the guy whose quote I used for my MPA slide at the beginning of my talk. And he spoke about how much he loved the old MPA and how those really were the best times of his life. There was a collective sigh in the packed room. The feeling of loss was palpable. The micro-histories that I have talked about tonight demonstrate how civic projects that foster an ethical community of compassion and connection can be a driver for progressive political thought and action. Take the Kitsilano Citizens Committee, for example. Here we had a group of people using a highly innovative approach to community mental health policy formation in its earliest years, signposting future participatory models of mental health policymaking. Today at Stella's Place, a mental health hub for young adults in downtown Toronto, programs are co-designed by professionals and young adults. And young adults are also involved in delivering and evaluating services. The executive director told me that when she took a group of their members down the road to the Center for Addictions and Mental Health for a meeting, the young adults just assumed a position of equality in the process, which took the mental health professionals at KMH back a little bit. And I can't help but think of the unrealized potential of those citizens committees as a way of working at the local level against the stigma and discrimination that has undermined people with mental health labels in the ensuing decades. I also see a bridge between Wieck and psychiatrist and anthropologist Arthur Kleinman's understanding of caregiving as a set of interpersonal exchanges that forefront the human element and the moral value of care. In each of my key three case studies, I also see echoes of Kleinman's wonderful questions for care providers that elicit insight into the client's worldview, culture, social context, and spirituality, and include, what do you fear most about your sickness? And what are the chief problems your sickness has caused for you, personally, family, work, etc.? Now, Kleinman didn't write those for mental health care, but I think they fit really well. MPA, Wieck, and the Citizens Committee modeled new ways of community support for people living with mental health differences that were grounded in, and these were grounded in broader counterculture values of democracy, shared authority, and civic engagement. This is relational citizenship in action, but it proved to be a brief moment. I could go on, but I'm going to let Tom Sanborn have the final word. And this again is from his 2010 interview.
When I say that, I think that the MPA model sort of brings in obliquely a kind of Langian perspective, in that there's a profound respect for the experience of the patient and the subject. The I at the beginning of the MPA sentence, at least in its best form, is the psychiatric survivor, not the doctor, not the social worker, not the house manager. And so I think that MPA's experience and other projects that have worked to create communities for ex-mental patients, like the Coast Foundation here, or even the support groups that exist in more clinical settings where the focus is on peer support and recognition of what can't be said out of peer experience to the particulars of a person's pain. All are part of that, it seems to me. We didn't have the whole of the truth in those days, but we had desperate hold, part of it.